Weather is the one thing in your garden that I think should make you humble. It's the one thing you absolutely under no circumstances can do anything about. And for everything in the garden, surviving or thriving all depends on the weather. At some point in the early spring, a crucial threshold is passed and ice begins to turn back into water. At that point, it's still pretty cold, but there's already some plants and animals that are ready to start the season. One of the first plants you'll see poking through the snow is the skunk cabbage. The skunk cabbage creates and releases a gas that heats up the area immediately surrounding it, melting a hole in the snow. That means that at the very beginning of the season, even before any of the spring bulbs have emerged, you can have these very dramatic structures bringing a bit of color to your garden. Some animals have adapted to be able to freeze and survive it. These are creatures that have blood that is so thick with dissolved chemicals that it never forms ice crystals. So they do freeze, but unlike us, it doesn't damage their cell membranes. And in wood frogs and lots of other animals that have just spent the winter just hiding out someplace in a dormant state and now emerge in time to see the last of the snow melt away. Sometimes people have the impression that nature has some sort of built-in clockwork, but I would have to say it doesn't seem like a very accurate view of nature to me, because it's relative clock. Things have to be linked to other things. You just can't work by the calendar. So, for example, lots of insects count on the appearance of very early flowers as nectar sources. Now, those plants have to wait for the weather to be right. They won't appear until after they've been a few warm days in a row. Then, and only then, will be a time for these insects to emerge. Spring is all about timing. If you flower too soon, there's good chance you'll be hit by a late frost. If you try to build your nest too late, there's good chance all the best territories will be taken. It's a big gamble, really, a roll of dice. Sometimes you win big, sometimes you go broke. The problem with this game is that the stakes are so high, if you lose, you may not survive. If a bumblebee, for example, happens to be protected over the winter in a place that warms up a little sooner than everywhere else, it could end up emerging long before there are any flowers up in bloom. And if a bee is not careful, it's going to die. Often people think that in nature there are no mistakes, but mistakes are everywhere you look. Birds, for example, migrate from the south to the north to start the breeding season. There is an advantage to arriving early because you get to be the first one to stake out the territory, and you get the best places to put your nest and all those sort of things. On the other hand, if you happen to arrive before there's anything to eat, you'll be early and dead. So timing is all about knowing what everybody else is doing. You don't want to be the first to leap, you really want to leap with the crowd at the right time. It's a compromise always. But once the spring has really set in, even if the nights are a bit cool, you can get all kinds of vegetation that can withstand a certain amount of freezing. And once you've got the vegetation, now you've got the basis of a whole mass of other kinds of growth. So insects can feed on the vegetation. Mammals can feed on the vegetation. Birds can feed on the insects, and now the season sort of lets go with an immense amount of activity. Everybody's out there trying to breed or be pollinated or feed, all at once, and everywhere you go, there's the sound of nature kind of bursting out. Now in spring, a lot of water will have evaporated into the atmosphere from the melted snow. But since the temperatures are still somewhat cool, it tends to turn back into liquid. That's good news for the plants in your garden because all of the moisture now gets to return to earth in the form of rain. As a gardener, you really wouldn't want to be without rain, but it can have its downside, especially if it goes on for too long. For example, if it's really pouring, most insects actually don't fly, so if you happen to be a creature that depends on them as a food source like a swallow or flower that depends on them for pollination, then you've got a problem. As the sun moves higher and higher into the sky, more and more of its energy is absorbed by the soil, and gradually the residual coolness of spring fades away. Everything in the garden, plant or animal, has to learn to deal with the unrelenting and searing heat of summer. The heat of summer can be a real challenge. Most organisms try to keep their internal temperature from rising too high, and one way to do that, of course, is to evaporate water from your surface. Now this can be a very effective strategy for temperature regulation. But if that's the approach you're going to take, you better be sure you've got lots and lots of water available for when you need it. Water is a weird molecule. One of its properties is that it absorbs an unusual amount of heat as it turns into a gas. So mammals make use of this evaporative cooling to keep their body temperature down, which is why mad dogs and Englishmen can go out into the noonday sun and survive. So what a dog will do, for example, is salivate and then pant, moving air across the water on its tongue and cooling its whole body down. Honeybees are insects that have also mastered this business of regulating their temperature using water evaporation. They will actually collect water and bring it back to the hive, and then they'll sit there, beating their wings like little fans to move air across the water, keeping the whole colony cool enough to function. Most insects, on the other hand, just let their temperature go up and down with the weather. Now everybody needs water to survive, but because they're not using it for cooling, they just don't use it very much. Many of them can go for days without it breathing quite comfortably. Those insects whose bodies are surrounded by a thick barrier of cuticle, like a grasshopper, need even less. That's why even on the hottest days of summer, you'll see grasshoppers out and active. Birds need water too, of course, and one of the best ways to attract birds to your garden is to have some sort of a water feature, especially one that includes a shallow area where they can comfortably stand to drink. If birds hear the sound of running water on a hot summer day, they'll come flocking to your garden from miles away. Now plants, just like animals, evaporate water to stay cool. They're not producing big drops of water that you can see on the surface of the leaves, but the process is the same and it's going on all the time. Now all the time that water is available, that's very effective. But if it's dry and hot, then they've got a new problem. On a hot, dry day, plants will be losing a lot of moisture, especially plants with big, broad leaves with lots of surface area. A plant like that will gradually wilt over the course of a day. The good news is that it's not a permanent condition. As soon as some water hits the ground, or as soon as the temperature starts to get a little cooler in the evening, they'll spring right back to life. Now some plants have figured out ways to get through a period of prolonged drought. Sometimes you'll see plants that look blue, like some kinds of hosta, for example. This is because those plants have a thick, waxy cuticle over the surface of their leaves. A blue spruce is like this. It has a translucent coating that lets sunlight in, but protects the leaves from water loss and the heat. And although the leaves are still green on the inside, what you see looking through this coating is blue. Another thing a lot of plants do is to have a really hairy leaf surface. Those hairs reduce the airflow over the leaf surface so that there is less chance for moisture to escape. Deep taproots are useful, of course, for finding hidden water, and a lot of weeds have deep taproots, and that's why they're hard to get rid of. The plants that we call succulents, like sedum and so on, have developed thick fleshy leaves, and protected below the surface of those leaves are large cells which store water in kind of gel. If you look at a group of plants like the hens and chicks, what you'll see is all these adaptations: thick wax cuticle, taproots, and in fact some of them even have hair all over the surface. For example, there's a group known as the cobweb varieties, which have little hair cover areas in the middle to protect the new growth. The ultimate drought-adapted plants, of course, are the cacti. Instead of trying to do photosynthesis with their leaves, they do photosynthesis on their stalks, so they often have enlarged barrel-shaped or tubular stalks, and the leaves are reduced into thorns. Now, cacti can only afford to flower during those brief periods when plenty of moisture is available. So many of them have spectacular displays to make sure they attract pollinators during that critical time. So cacti can be stunningly beautiful plants when they're in flower. Now, most gardeners get dry summers, and they pour gallons and gallons of water into their gardens every year to support plants that really have no business growing in that climate at all. The other approach is really just to say, look, I live in a particular place, I should probably learn to appreciate exactly what I've got and grow what is local. If you have happened to live in the American Southwest, and it's really hot and dry, why not grow cacti and succulents and all kinds of plants that are already drought adapted? They're referred to as xerophytes or xerophytic plants. Even in temperate climates, people who want to save themselves a little trouble can create what are called creek gardens. Gardens completely made up of drought-tolerant plants. So you can make a spectacular garden, but one where you never have to put a sprinkler out there, where you'll never have to have a hose out there at all. Now, it is possible to grow plants in areas where the climate isn't entirely suitable to meet their needs. But to do that, you have to have the right microclimate. So, for example, in this case, acanthus is one of my favorite plants. But it comes from the Mediterranean region, so really it shouldn't make it through our winters, it's just too cold here. But by siting it just right, so it's protected from the worst winter winds by a backdrop of evergreens, and where it's protected from a little bit of the winter sun, it comes through the winters just fine. In fact, it flowers beautifully here. One spot that will produce a bit of microclimate is a south-facing wall. If you've got a wall that gets that little bit of extra sun, it's well an opportunity to grow something that's not really from your climate zone. Now, rhododendrons are a plant that needs a sheltered environment. There's all kinds of species, and all of them have all sorts of gorgeous flowers and beautiful evergreen foliage. Now, you can't just put a rhododendron anywhere and expect it to do well. If they get exposed to the full sun, for example, they will lose all of the water from the leaves and dry up. What you'll see in this situation is that they'll actually curl their leaves up to protect the underside of the leaf, which is where most of the evaporation takes place. They'll actually use the same adaptation again to get through the winter. Now, on a mild winter day, rhododendrons will still be doing photosynthesis, but on a cold day, it's just not worth it. So they roll up their leaves, give up on photosynthesis for the day, and protect themselves from the weather. What this means is that you can actually use your rhododendron as a sort of thermometer. If you look out the window and see all of the leaves curled up, you know it's cold. So by providing a few overhanging trees of shelter, and by choosing a south-facing site for warmth, a gardener can actually create a little pocket where the weather is just a little bit different and make it possible for a beautiful but fragile plant to thrive. Now, one of the enemies against which plants have to be protected is the wind. It's actually the wind that's largely responsible for a lot of the dehydration that goes on and can create a fair number of problems. Some plants are really well adapted to the wind. Lots of grasses, for example, have really thin foliage, not much of a sail effect, when wind blows through them. Other plants have actually dealt with the wind by staying really low to the ground. So lots of alpine plants are only 1 or 2 inches maximum above the ground surface. So really they're quite well protected from it. Other plants that typically grow in forest regions are not very well adapted to wind. For example, a maidenhair fern has really open, lacy foliage with almost no protective mechanisms on the surface to reduce water loss to wind. The wind just carries moisture away with it, the same way it dries out laundry on a clothesline. And not every plant can put up with that kind of treatment. Now the wind does have some good qualities. In the fall, as plants prepare to spread their seeds, a lot of them depend on the wind to help them out. A lot of seeds are quite intricately adapted to take advantage of the wind, because really the only way for a plant to travel is to hitch a ride with somebody. Maple keys are a good example. You'd think to look at them that they would turn sideways and fall down through the air like knife. But instead, they use air resistance to set up the spinning motion that enables them to travel for great distances from their parent plant to the ground. Towards the end of a long hot summer, you can already start to see the effects of wear and tear on the garden. Flowers are starting to fade, leaves are starting to deteriorate. Basically, the processes of senescence are setting in. Now, in the case of herbaceous perennials, their strategy for surviving the winter is just to die right back down to the ground. Trees, on the other hand, really have one of two strategies. Some are going to be deciduous, they'll tend to drop all their leaves for the winter, while others will be evergreen. Evergreen trees keep their leaves all through the winter, so they can take advantage of what little sunlight they get. It's an adaptation that works well in a very cold climate. But a little further south, and you'll find that deciduous trees really have the edge. They have big broad leaf surfaces that collect lots of sunlight. But when autumn comes, those leaves become a liability. So they just close up shop, they lose their chlorophyll and turn red or brown. And the trees just drop them. It might seem like a lot of work for nothing, but in fact those leaves will usually wind up decaying under the tree, returning their nutrients to the soil and eventually back to the tree itself. Now there are some plants which are cold adapted and they love this time of year. While everyone else is dropping their leaves, they'll be putting on a last spurt of growth and getting an advantage for next season. A lot of these plants are weeds, and you'll actually find that at this time of the year, it's a pretty good time to spot the weeds in the garden. They'll be the ones putting out new growth and maybe even flowering. One of the real defining characteristics of a particular place is going to be the winter time. In much of North American winter means really low temperatures and a ground covered in snow. This is a difficult time for most living things. A lot of birds migrate. They just go somewhere where it's warmer. Some birds, on the other hand, they're the ones who are very flexible about what they eat. They'll switch to things like animal fat or seeds that are stored, or seeds that are in bird feeders, that sort of thing. They'll just withstand the cold. They just put up with it. And of course, mammals can stay active all winter long. That's kind of the point of being a mammal. Squirrels, for example, will have stored seeds in advance, so they'll have food supplies, which they can use all winter long to keep their body temperatures up. Now, of course, insects don't have the option of remaining active. They're cold-blooded. So ladybugs, for example, will have selected a safe haven somewhere to sit the winter out. A few other species like morning clock butterflies also overwinter as adults. And most other insects, like the praying mantis, will have died, leaving behind only a structure in which their young can survive as eggs. Down in the soil, the seeds of all sorts of plants will be just waiting for the warmth of spring to start their germination. And the snow will act as a protective covering, keeping those hidden creatures and the crowns and roots of perennial plants protected from the worst of the cold above. So when you look at a winter landscape, everything seems pretty quiet. But really, what you really have is this massive potential, resources and mass, ready to spring to life as soon as the forced warm weather returns.